From my side, my topic, I would be different from others. And I will not speak about the advantages of the country where I work, and it's the Ukraine. I would say that the Ukrainian business are looking for and considering other countries to set up their foreign economic activities or encounter some issues. So my presentation would be aimed to share those observations that customers encounter. Regarding questions that we received from conference participants, we noticed many questions about banks. That's what we see. Most customers encounter if they have companies abroad and they need to open bank account regardless of jurisdiction. Have representative, owner, beneficiary coming from the Ukraine. If it's just a regular businessman opening a company, there's a large number of questions from banks regarding the business and the sources, the origins of funds and activities planned, directors, etc. Or to encounter even those groups of companies where beneficiaries are not trying to hide the structure of their ownership and quite open, owing their structures to banks. There's still a large number of questions to them, and they need to submit additional documents. And there are some countries, and it's experience, it's the Ukrainian perspective. We have representatives of various countries that can share and ask questions about their countries. Maybe it's different, but there is a number of countries asking additional questions about Ukrainian beneficiaries. So if you encountered similar questions, you're not the only one. It's a certain trend. There's a lot of nuances why it happened, because partially it's AML legislation in the European Union that was also implemented in many countries to a certain extent, but these are also changes in legislation. We're all familiar with BEPS, action plan, OECD, unify certain issues related to foreign economic activities at the level of legislation of various countries, so that there's no dilution of tax base and no temptation of business to take advantage of those benefits of other countries, and no efforts to play with these additional advantages of various countries. Automatic exchange as a standard of tax information also influenced the number of questions coming from banks, and banks are now, apart from the functions of client identification in AML, they should also determine tax residency of their customers and determine not only the jurisdiction and citizenship, but also where they pay taxes. So that's additional fiscal function. Banks obliges them to create many questions and check additional information, especially in a situation where they have doubts about truthful information about residency. It's physical and legal entities, because their beneficiaries should be identified. Financial institutions, having determined the status of a customer, they transfer this information to a tax service of their country that also automatically transfers this information to their colleagues in the tax service of another country, which representatives were identified as their customers and tax residents. Therefore, banks have to make additional compliance checks as for both existing, where this standard becomes effective regarding the Ukraine. Currently, the Ukraine has not joined this exchange of information. It is planned in the near future. There was a meeting today with the Ministry of Finance and the American Chamber of Commerce, and we raised this issue whether Ukraine is going to join this. And the work is ongoing, and this plan additional audits of the system readiness and process needed in order to ensure this exchange of information, and possibly in 2021 the Ukraine will join this agreement. And also, since 2022. This mechanism will become effective for the Ukrainian tax authority and Ukrainian residents. It means the Ukrainian party will get information regarding the accounts, financial accounts of Ukrainian residents abroad. Therefore, there's a question for existing accounts and especially about opening new accounts, so that to determine the status of a potential customer. So when these questions come up, without saying that banks have their own additional procedures, some countries obliged, like Switzerland, bank managers can be criminally liable if they don't perform their client identification. So that's why they ask many questions, not only about the status, but about the origin. Speaking about conducting business, if it's a foreign company, not Ukrainian, but registered in EU with a bank account, they ask questions how the company is managed with Ukrainian beneficiary, where this process of management, where it's located, where are people are located, substance of the business, and very often they have questions like that. So based on their satisfaction of these responses, sometimes it's enough to have documents that clients submit. Sometimes it's not enough. If banks still have doubts, they ask for additional legal opinion from a third-party organization that will make additional check, certain audit, tax audit, and clarify and explain that there were no violations of this beneficiary that owns accounts or this company registered in foreign jurisdiction, whether there were any violations by this company of requirements of the Ukrainian legislation. So what we're noticing that actually, on the one hand, there are amendments in the Ukrainian legislation also aimed for this automatic exchange and implementing initiatives and strict benefits for avoidance. And on the one hand, they require more compliance and additional audits to ensure these requirements for Ukrainian tax authority. And on the other hand, this additional function is performed by the foreign bank, which also checks whether these requirements are met of another country. So now we'll go over the risks related to that, but the first impression and conclusion that we make that customers are wary of the Ukrainian tax authority less than they are wary of closing accounts or possibility of cooperation with a good foreign bank. And this happens because in terms of tax risks, and this legislation has not been tested, there is a feeling that tax authorities have not found these risks and not raised this issue. It's purely theoretical and sometimes may come up, but the tax authority needs to make some actions to find out. But for a bank, the situation is already current and they ask to confirm compliance in order to open an account. So very often the requests are emerging within this banking question. So what are these questions? First of all, it's a standard situation that may be relevant very often for the Ukrainian, not only Ukrainian, Eastern Europe, where there's a foreign company, but actually the beneficiary is Ukrainian and it doesn't not only own the business, but manages the business, but mostly located outside of the country where it's registered. So we come back to the issue of substance. We discussed the situation whether substance is needed or not in terms of creating a company abroad. There may be a situation that the office in local legislation may not be needed to be registered to get a number in foreign country and to open an account and use the advantages of local legislation. But for tax legislation of the Ukraine, there might be risks. If a foreign company doesn't have substance and the main profit and all personnel and assets involved in this profit located in the Ukraine, then from the point of view of Ukrainian legislation, say that this foreign company actually has a permanent representative in the Ukraine that should be taxed according to Ukrainian rules, because commercial activities in the Ukraine territory. It's a complex issue and was raised, but these risks exist where banks see that this situation may be relevant. They want to make sure that Ukrainian legislation was not breached. So if it's applicable to you, and even if you haven't got this request, you need to think ahead how you're going to justify and answer the questions of banks. The second question, which is not so relevant because the law was adopted that delayed these rules for 1 year, but since 1st of January next year will be a concept of management in Ukraine. Could be like permanent residence, permanent representative, but it's not activities, but management of company activities is in the Ukraine. If top management is in the Ukraine and main decisions on companies are made from there, then from 1st of January next year, this could be criteria to acknowledge this company as a non-resident registered in another country, or legally would be registered like in Cyprus or Malta or Poland or Luxembourg or Switzerland. But in terms of tax legislation, it would be tax resident of the Ukraine and have certain obligations for paying taxes here.
So this issue has been postponed by 1 year. However, this test compliance will be also verification will also be performed by foreign banks and ask you as to your tax residency status based on a country of incorporation and not have an obligation to pay tax in the Ukraine. That's from the future. So today, beneficiary ownership issues, UBO, do bear relevance. Whether the UBO taxes are in proper jurisdiction to avoid double taxation. Please allow me to explain the point of the concept of beneficiary owner. If the Ukraine sees a payment towards a non-resident company, either dividends or interest, or these are the most common, then the convention applies, and to apply the withholding, not the withholding tax, but the reduced tax rate, which is provided to avoid double taxation. Then they need to make sure that a number of criteria are complied. Well, first, formal, like residency status. Also, you need to prove that the resident company is a beneficiary, ultimate beneficiary owner, UBO, of such income. This is a really subjective issue. It's not very straightforward in terms of evidence, because there is no clear definition in our legislation regarding UBOs, ultimate beneficiary owners, and there is no list of documents which will certainly give you a peace of mind in terms of talking to the tax authorities, since if your company is a non-UBO, then it should enjoy the full tax rates. Well, this is a very ambiguous area, and it's a classic case where the income recipient will not be a beneficiary. This is back-to-back financing structures. For instance, when a Ukrainian company receives income from a non-resident company who in turn had received this money through loan from another company, for instance. So for the ultimate purpose to issue this loan to a Ukrainian company so that the tax rate on withholding tax in the Ukraine to enjoy the much lower tax bracket rather than Ukrainian company directly asking the second company in this chain. It's a complicated mechanism, but from this viewpoint, the company issuing a loan is also looked at, and its status as a UBO certainly it's on case-by-case basis, but it can be queried by the tax office. It's an issue which is also constantly verified. It is often checked by Ukrainian banks when paying this type of income to the non-residents, currency control. Also, foreign banks use it when conducting verifications on the UBOs, whether they correctly paid all the taxes from their income obligations in the Ukraine. So other issues of residency of ultimate beneficiary owners are also raised within the framework of CRS, Common Reporting Standard. You don't necessarily need to be a tax resident of the country, so every country enjoys its own rules to define residency. And regarding Ukraine, it's very important to note that from next year, where Ukraine will see the rule of controlled foreign companies, it's very important because when a person, tax resident of Ukraine, is paying his taxes, it's an important issue. How do we tax this income on private account under the CFC and CIT legislation? So, in brief, unfortunately, we do not have much time to get into the risks in detail. However, this is the reason why I described it, because these issues are becoming very important today. On the one hand, the tax authorities can also monitor these obligations, and also the foreign banks, most of all, are forced to conduct this due diligence, this compliance when opening accounts. And the risks here are not tax risks, but the risks of being refused in opening an account, registering an account, or closing an existing account. There are also situations when certain assets, financial assets on account are frozen. So the changes in the tax legislation need to be well researched, even though it works in terms of foreign companies. If you're the ultimate beneficiary owner, you need to make sure that you're protected from any possible conflict with taxation, and are prepared to reply and provide all the necessary documentation and proof to your bank to continue working with your bank. That's all for me. In brief, I have talked a lot about the changes to taxation legislation in the Ukraine. I didn't have a chance to discuss it in detail, but you will be able to look up more details in our Telegram channel, Tax and Legal. All the latest trends in currency, financial, tax, legal. Please follow us, look it up. Thank you very much for your time.